Hey, friends, Kenny Ortiz here. In this video, I'm going to give a short exhortation from First Timothy chapter 1. This video is being recorded primarily for my students at Bethany Global University as a part of the pastoral epistles class, but I'm going to put this live on YouTube. And whenever I do that, I inevitably get other people watching this. So if you're not one of my students, thanks for watching. Glad to have you. If you have any questions for me, just drop a comment in the comment section below. If you're one of my students at BGU, feel free to shoot me an email, reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm going to give a quick exhortation from First Timothy chapter 1. And the book of First Timothy, written by the Apostle Paul to his protege Timothy, just brilliant letter, very helpful, gives us all sorts of great doctrine and insights about how we ought to think about God's church, to think about ecclesiology, to think about God's mission for the church. And there's various warnings from the Apostle Paul in this letter. And the early part of the letter really gives kind of it's foundational. It's kind of a lot of preamble. And so one of the preamble things that we get here from the Apostle Paul, in the first few chapters, Paul's giving an introduction. Then he gives a warning about false teachers. Then he talks about the fact that Christ came to save sinners, as you can see the headline there, or the subheading from the ESV. And then later in this letter, he begins to also then mention again by name. He calls out some of the names of the false teachers. Just side note. I always think it's interesting when some people are bothered by preachers calling out other preachers by name. Now, I agree. We need to be very careful when we do that. We want to be very gracious. We want to make sure that we are speaking with specificity and accuracy. That we're not just using ad hominem attacks, and we're not broad stroke, using unfair broad strokes. We want to make sure that we are accurately representing someone. However, if there is a prominently well-known preacher or well-known Christian leader that is influential, that is teaching something false, that is harmful, it is appropriate for other pastors to call them out by name and to call out the devastation that teaching could cause. Because this is exactly what the Apostle Paul does here. The Apostle Paul is modeling for us how to rebuke and address false teachers. So it's a fascinating passage. I think it's really helpful. Again, we want to be very gracious toward people. We want to give people the benefit of the doubt when at all possible. We shouldn't just willy-nilly be calling people out. We want to be very careful before we label someone a heretic. I think there's a lot of wisdom in being kind and gentle and slow to speak, especially on social media. However, there does come a time where it is appropriate to call people out by name publicly as a means of protecting the church, God's people, from false teachers. Now, in this letter, the Apostle Paul calls out people by name, but he also, more than just individual names, he gives categories. He's like, people who are like this, people who are like this, people who are like this. And there's one particular category of people that he calls out here in chapter 1 that I want to highlight for you, because I think it's just really insightful, really helpful to us, particularly in our modern context today. Okay, so it's taking me a second here to make sure I got it right here. Okay. The Apostle Paul is telling Timothy, I'm urging you to remain in Ephesus, to make sure there's no, he says in verse 3, that no persons are teaching any different doctrine. So Paul's like, listen, I taught certain doctrine when I was there in Ephesus, all right? Timothy, don't let anyone teach anything other than what I taught. It's unacceptable, all right? Which Paul is implying that there is a right set of doctrines and a wrong set of doctrines. I think sometimes in our American evangelical circles, we have this idea that, we have to let everyone have their opinion. I don't know that that's actually a helpful approach in a lot of cases. Again, we always want to be gracious. We always want to be kind. We always want to be slow to speak. But we also want to be bold. And I think that's what the Apostle Paul is telling us here to do. He's telling people, listen, don't devote yourself to myths or endless genealogies or just random speculations. He's telling them all these things to do. Um, and then he says in verse 6, certain persons, by swerving from these are the pure heart and good conscience and sincere faith. So he says in verse 5, I want people to have good conscience, sincere faith. I want these people to be committed to having a pure heart. But there are certain persons that are swerving away from these things that I want. Okay. And then he says to them, they have wandered away into vain discussions. There's a group of people. Paul is telling Timothy, there's a group of people that they're not focused on having a pure heart. They're not focused on having a good conscience. They're not focused on having sincere faith. In fact, they have swerved away from these good and godly things. And now they are focused on vain discussions. They're focused on having a lot of discussions about a lot of things that are not helpful to anyone. They're a waste of time. They're arguing about things. They're arguing maybe elements of theology that are not worth arguing. Maybe they're arguing about things in politics or culture or whatever. We don't know exactly what these people are arguing about, but we do know that the Apostle Paul is frustrated with these people, and he's telling Timothy, they're having these long arguments, these long debates and discussions about things that are in vain. They're useless. They're not helpful. It's a waste. It's a waste of time. Timothy, be on guard with those kinds of people, which is, I think, this is so helpful for our modern context, right? Then Paul goes on to describe these people more in verse 7. He says they are desiring to be teachers of the law, right? And when you read this in the context of the pastoral epistles, he's not meaning just Old Testament law. It becomes clear to us he's talking about people who want to be teachers of God's law in the modern church, in the New Testament church in Timothy's day. And so Paul is saying there's a bunch of people. There's these certain persons. They desire to be teachers of the law. They desire to be pastors, preachers, church leaders. They want to be influential over God's people. They want to be influential Christians in the Christian context. That's what these people are longing for. Okay, Timothy. And then Paul says this about them. He says, but they long to be influential. They long to be teachers of the law, but without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Oh, what a great verse for us to consider in our modern context. The Apostle Paul is saying, Timothy, there's people in your midst that want to be influential, but they don't know what they're talking about, right? Look what Paul says again. Right? He says that they're longing to be teachers of the law without understanding. They lack understanding what they are saying. They're doing a lot of talking, but they don't know what the heck they're talking about. They're talking out of their you know what, right? There's a lot of vain discussions, and they have a lack of understanding of the things they're talking about, and a lack of understanding about the things they are making confident assertions about. These people are talking about all sorts of stuff, and are talking about it with such confidence, even though they don't know what they're talking about. Timothy, be on guard for those kinds of people. They want to be influential in the church. They want to be teachers of the law, but don't let it happen, Timothy. Rebuke those people. Don't let these people become influential in the church, Timothy. Guard the people of God from these people over here that long to be influential over God's people, even though they don't know what the heck they're talking about. Guard them. Guard the people of God away from these people. I think this is a remarkable insight from the Apostle Paul that applies to us today so profoundly. The Apostle Paul continues. He says, now we know that the law is good. I'm going to skip down right here. He begins to talk about people that need to be guarded against, that the church needs to be guarded from. He says, unholy and profane people, people who strike their mothers and fathers, murderers, sexually immoral people, people who practice homosexuality, enslavers. The literal Greek there is man-stealers, liars, perjurers. Basically, Paul's saying, listen, there's all these types of people that should not be leaders in the church and should not be influential in the church, right? So he's mentioning people who strike their parents, enslavers, people who are profane, people who practice homosexuality, people who are murderous, who do all sorts of evil. He gives this list of people that Paul is saying, Timothy, this list of people, do not let them be influential in the church. But it's remarkable to me. The Apostle Paul starts the list. At the top of the list are people who make confident assertions, even though they don't know what they're talking about. Yikes. Homosexuality, murder, disobeying your parents or striking your parents, slavery, lying. There's a long list of categories here that Paul is mentioning. These are the type of people that should not be influential in God's house. At the top of that list, the list in which he starts with, the first category he addresses in this chapter are people who are confident but don't know what they're talking about. That should be quite compelling to us in many ways. So here's my exhortation. Be extremely cautious that you do not make confident assertions about things, that you don't speak with confidence about things unless you actually know what you're talking about. I think this applies in a lot of areas. As we read through 1st and 2nd Timothy, we see that the Apostle Paul has a very holistic view on how these things apply. We see the Apostle Peter picking up some similar themes in some ways. And again, he has a very holistic way on how these things apply to our lives. Certainly this applies to theology in the Bible. You should not try to be a teacher of the law and preach God's word if you don't have a thorough understanding of God's word. You want to be extremely careful that you don't get up and teach theology unless you have, and you don't get up and make confident assertions unless you've done some good research, some good reading, some good study. Be extremely careful in that regard. I think this also, though, applies to some other areas of our lives. I see a lot of people today posting things on social media about COVID, vaccines, about responsibilities of government, the Constitution. I mean, there's a lot of people saying a lot of things on social media. And my observation is that the vast majority of people posting the stuff that they're saying, they don't know what they're talking about. They're making very confident assertions. They're very confident in what they're saying, but they actually don't know what they're talking about. They're actually quite ignorant of some things. And I would say be very careful about those things. Be very careful that we don't make confident assertions about how these things work out in the church. So I think when it comes to politics, cultural engagement, worldview, as well as doctrine, theology, and biblical studies, I think the Apostle Paul would exhort us to be very wise and be very careful that we don't speak too confidently about matters that maybe we are ignorant of. If you know people that speak very confidently about things they don't know what they're talking about, protect the people of God from them. And if you are one of the people making a lot of confident assertions about things you don't know what you're talking about, I would encourage you to repent.